The year was 1881, and in a remote corner of rural England, the fog hung low over the fields, thick and unyielding, as if the land itself sought to hide its secrets. Villagers moved quietly along narrow dirt paths, eyes downcast, whispering in hushed tones about deaths, disappearances, and events long since buried in the shadows of memory. It was the kind of place where stories were passed in trembling voices beside hearth fires, stories that warned of children vanishing, of families touched by unseen forces, and of cemeteries that seemed alive with the past. Among these hushed tales was the story of a child whose life was brief, but whose death would haunt the village for decades. Look closely at the photograph that survives, a sepia-toned image of a grave, delicate and worn, the inscription barely legible. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A small plot of earth, a wooden cross, a family in mourning. But hidden in the shadows was something sinister. Two dates were etched into the wood, overlapping in a way that no grieving family would normally allow. It was as if time itself had fractured, leaving a child trapped between two burials, two deaths, and two stories no one dared to speak aloud. The child's name was Eleanor Gray. She had lived only 8 short years, and in that brief life, had been the center of both adoration and unease. Strange families were not uncommon in this village, families who whispered in forbidden languages, whose children seemed to vanish into thin air, or whose portraits carried a chilling aura that could unsettle even the most stoic visitor. Eleanor's family, however, had been particularly reclusive, and neighbors remembered little more than glimpses of the child playing near the edge of the woods, always alone, always watching. Some whispered she spoke in tongues that no one could understand, that her laughter carried secrets older than the village itself. The first hints of her tragic fate came in the winter of 1881. A sudden illness swept through the Gray household, claiming Eleanor swiftly and leaving her parents in stunned silence. Post-mortem photography, a grim custom of the era, was arranged. Look closely at the photograph of Eleanor as she lay in repose. At first, it seems peaceful, her small hands folded, her eyes closed. But a deeper gaze reveals the unsettling details. A shadow across her face, a crooked cross in the background, and the faint outline of figures that no one claimed to be in the room. Such images, now preserved in yellowed archives, were meant to memorialize life, but in Eleanor's case, they whispered of a darker truth, of a child whose death would not rest quietly in the soil. The village itself was steeped in eerie history. The cemetery where Eleanor was first laid to rest had long been associated with vanished children, forgotten events, and unsettling history that older villagers avoided discussing. Graves of infants were marked with crude wooden crosses, some bearing signs of tampering, others untouched by time yet strangely decayed. It was a place haunted not only by spirits, but by the chilling secrets of a sinister past, where each plot carried a story of tragedy, each stone a record of lives lost too soon. That first burial seemed ordinary to the untrained eye. The local priest officiated, prayers were whispered, and the mourners departed with heavy hearts. But from the moment the soil covered her tiny coffin, strange things began to unfold. Footsteps in the dirt when no one was near. The faint sound of a child's laughter on windless nights, and letters in the Gray household that spoke of dreams that Eleanor appeared in, always pale, always silent, eyes fixed on something unseen. It was as if the boundary between life and death had weakened, leaving an echo of Eleanor trapped in the space between. In the days that followed, rumors spread. Some claimed the grave had been disturbed, though no one admitted to such acts. Others insisted the photograph showed a figure lurking behind the mourning parents, a figure that vanished when the image was retaken. These were not idle tales. The villagers understood the language of omens, the signs that foretold misfortune and death. And with Eleanor's grave, every detail seemed to carry a warning, every shadow a message unspoken. The story of the child who would come to be known as the Forgotten Child had begun. A story entwined with disturbing images, haunted places, and the kind of chilling secrets that time tries desperately to erase. But this was only the beginning. The village, the family, and the photographs themselves held layers of mystery that no one could unravel. layers that would eventually reveal a truth so unsettling. It demanded that the child be buried not once, but twice. Eleanor Gray was no ordinary child. To the villagers, she was quiet, distant, and somehow apart. Her eyes seemed to follow shadows that no one else noticed, and she moved with a careful precision that unnerved even the most patient neighbors. Some said she spoke in whispers that no one could understand, a forbidden language carried on the wind like an echo from another time. Others claimed she vanished for hours at a time, wandering the woods at the edge of the village, returning as if nothing had happened, yet somehow changed. The village itself was small, built from timber and stone, surrounded by thick forests that darkened early each day. Life was simple, routine, and governed by superstition. Children were rarely left alone, for the woods were considered haunted, a place where lost souls and restless spirits lingered. Strange families had long lived here, reclusive households whose origins were forgotten in time, who spoke in hushed tones, whose children sometimes vanished, only to reappear days later, pale and silent. Eleanor's family fit this pattern in every unsettling detail. Her parents, though outwardly proper, carried a heaviness in their eyes, a weight of secrets they refused to share. The villagers noticed their odd habits: shutters kept tightly closed, late-night visits to the cemetery, and rituals performed in whispers beneath the moonlight. Some suspected the family was cursed, touched by a sinister past no one dared investigate. Others simply avoided them, leaving Eleanor to roam the village streets alone, collecting small trinkets and staring at people with an unsettling intensity. From an early age, Eleanor displayed behaviors that set her apart. She spoke of things she could not have known: old houses long forgotten, graves whose names had been erased, and stories of vanished children. She seemed to understand the eerie details of death and loss, as if she were studying them like a scholar of the macabre. Some villagers dismissed this as imagination. Others whispered that the child had glimpsed beyond the veil, that she carried knowledge no living person should possess. Neighbors remembered the first hints of unease. A group of children playing in the fields reported that Eleanor would vanish and reappear with dirt on her shoes, even when she had been inside all day. A local seamstress swore she saw the child speaking to a figure no one else could see, a shadow that mimicked Eleanor's gestures and then vanished behind the trees. Look closely at old photographs of the village. Faded and yellowed, they seem ordinary at first. But hidden in the backgrounds, near the edge of the frame, are tiny forms, barely perceptible, that resemble Eleanor's small figure, always watching, always silent. The villagers tried to explain her oddities with logic. Perhaps she suffered from a strange illness, or a developmental condition misunderstood by a superstitious society. Perhaps it was simply the imagination of a lonely child, wandering too far from the safety of home. Yet history, dark history preserved in diaries, letters, and whispered tales, suggested otherwise. Eleanor's presence was tied to something older, something hidden in the soil and stone of the village itself. Some believed the cemetery near the woods was cursed, that children who spent time near it carried the mark of restless spirits, that they glimpsed secrets too terrible for adult minds to comprehend. Her interactions with adults were even more unsettling. Priests noted her knowledge of rituals and prayers she had never been taught. She would linger near post-mortem photographs, staring long enough to make the living uncomfortable, as if she could sense what the deceased wanted to say. Visitors to the village recalled her intense gaze, the way she seemed to pierce through the body into the soul, and how she sometimes spoke of vanished children in other towns, children no one else remembered. These stories were dismissed as coincidence until patterns began to emerge. Eleanor's life, though brief, became a thread connecting the village to a series of unsolved mysteries. Forgotten events resurfaced whenever she wandered the cemetery or the edge of the forest, as if her presence awakened the sleeping past. People began to notice strange families, their history entwined with dark secrets, their children vanishing and reappearing, always with that same pale, distant look in their eyes. And when Eleanor spoke, her words carried a weight, as if she were revealing truths the villagers were not ready to hear, truths about disturbing images, forbidden knowledge, and the hidden life of the cemetery itself. As the days passed, whispers grew louder. Some swore that the child's presence drew shadows from the past, shadows of deaths long forgotten, of graves unmarked, of children buried in haste or secrecy. There was a tension in the village, subtle yet pervasive, as if everyone sensed that Eleanor's story would not end quietly. Something was coming, something that would shatter the fragile boundary between life and death, between memory and history. And then, the first real anomaly occurred. A villager reported seeing a small figure near the cemetery at dawn, digging into the earth where no grave should have been. At first, it seemed impossible. But the photograph taken afterward, faded, damaged, and almost unreadable, showed the outline of a child and a disturbed patch of soil. No one could explain it. No one could claim responsibility. And no one wanted to. For this was only the beginning. The day Eleanor Gray died was gray itself, as if the sky mourned alongside her small family. A hush fell over the village. Windows shuttered early, and even the wind seemed to pause, carrying only the faintest whisper of sorrow. Neighbors murmured prayers in doorways, their voices trembling, unsure whether they were calling for Eleanor or for their own protection from the unsettling shadows her death had awakened. Her parents, hollow-eyed and trembling, prepared the child for burial. In accordance with post-mortem photography customs, they dressed her in fine linens, folding her hands across her chest, her tiny face pale but still hauntingly serene. Look closely at the photograph taken that day. At first glance, it captures a tender scene of grief, but hidden in the folds of her dress and the dark corners of the room are unsettling details. Faint smudges on the floor, shadows that do not match the bodies in the image, and the faintest outline of a figure standing where no one remembers standing. It was a record meant to honor life, yet it hinted at something more sinister, something no living eye should witness. The funeral procession was small, somber, and tense. Villagers gathered at the edge of the cemetery, their faces drawn tight with fear. Some had seen Eleanor wandering near the woods in the days before her death. Others whispered of strange families whose children vanished in similar ways. The coffin was carried slowly over the frost-bitten earth. Each step seemed heavy with unseen weight. At the grave, the priest recited prayers, but even his voice faltered when he noticed the unease in the air. It was as if the cemetery itself knew something the villagers did not, that the child they were burying was not destined to remain beneath the soil. The first burial was meant to be simple, yet anomalies quickly emerged. The earth over Eleanor's grave sank strangely, as though something beneath it refused to settle. Flowers placed upon the soil wilted in hours, despite the cold. Animals avoided the sight, shying away with teeth bared and fur raised. And some neighbors claimed to hear soft crying at night, the kind of sound that sends a chill straight through the heart, yet vanished when approached. These were not idle superstitions. The villagers were familiar with haunted places, with chilling secrets buried under stone and soil. And Eleanor's grave carried them all. Letters from the Gray household, preserved in fragile archives, hinted at growing fear. The parents wrote of dreams in which Eleanor appeared, sometimes smiling, sometimes staring silently into the distance. She whispered things in a language they could not understand, words older than memory, words that seemed to belong to the vanished children whose stories had long been forgotten. Look closely at the descriptions in these letters, and the unease becomes tangible. There is a sense of someone, or something, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step from the past into the present. Even the priest noticed irregularities. The ritual was conducted carefully, according to every custom. Candles flickered in the windless air, prayers were spoken, and the village records meticulously noted the burial. Yet he later confessed that he felt watched. Something had followed the coffin into the earth, something that left no footprints, no trace, but whose presence could not be denied. Some claim this was simply grief manifesting as imagination, yet when post-mortem photographs surfaced showing Eleanor's coffin as it was lowered into the grave, the shadows around it seemed to twist unnaturally, as if the soil itself resisted. Rumors began to circulate immediately after the burial. Villagers spoke of objects moving in the Gray household, of windows rattling when no wind blew, and of distant laughter echoing through the woods at night. Some reported seeing a small figure near the cemetery, pale and silent, turning as if aware of being observed. These accounts were dismissed by many at first, attributed to superstition and fear. Yet patterns emerged, connecting Eleanor's death to earlier tragedies. Vanished children, families who spoke in forbidden languages, and post-mortem photographs that carried more than memory. They carried the weight of something darker, something buried but not gone. The first burial should have ended the story, yet it did not. Strange occurrences intensified. Soil disturbed itself overnight. Shadows lingered too long. And those who approached the grave reported a sense of being watched, a sense that the boundary between the living and the dead had been breached. Villagers who had once been skeptical began to whisper of a hidden truth, of an unsettling history that refused to stay buried. By the time the graves returned to their home, the air around them had thickened with dread. Letters, photographs, and even whispered recollections hinted at an unfinished story. Something had followed Eleanor from the grave. Something was not content to remain hidden. And while the village tried to resume normal life, a sense of unease persisted, like a low, unending hum beneath the surface of the familiar. The first burial was over. The earth covered the coffin. The village dispersed, and yet the shadow of Eleanor's presence lingered. Something had been disturbed, something that would demand attention. For the child who had already vanished once in life would vanish again in death. And the world would remember her not once, but twice. The cemetery where Eleanor Gray rested was older than the village itself. Stones, cracked and moss-covered, marked graves whose names had long been forgotten, erased by time and weather. At night, the wind whispered through the crooked iron gates, carrying voices no living person could understand. Villagers claimed that if you listened closely, the whispers were not of the wind, but of children long dead, calling out to the living in fragmented, forbidden language. Some dared not enter after sundown. Long before Eleanor's death, strange events had haunted this place. Families vanished, their homes abandoned overnight. Children disappeared into the woods, only to reappear days later, pale, silent, and changed. Letters and diaries that survived hint at an eerie pattern. Graves disturbed without explanation, post-mortem photographs showing faint, unaccounted figures, and families whose histories were intertwined with tragedy and strange customs. Look closely at those old photographs, and at first, they seem ordinary. But hidden in the shadows are chilling details, tiny forms behind trees, blurred figures near tombstones, and eyes that seem to follow the viewer. Eleanor's arrival in this story seemed almost predestined. Her parents were not the first in the village to experience unexplainable loss, nor would they be the last. Stories whispered in hushed tones spoke of families who kept forbidden books, who murmured in lost languages, and who treated the death of a child as both a sorrow and a secret. The Gray family, though outwardly respectable, carried this same weight. Their home was filled with relics of the past, photographs of vanished children, letters in languages no one could read, and objects that seemed to move of their own accord. Villagers recalled that Eleanor, even in life, seemed drawn to the cemetery's oldest sections. She would wander among the cracked stones, speaking softly to names no one remembered, touching graves as if feeling the lingering memories beneath the soil. Some swore she conversed with shadows, whispering back in words that sounded older than the village itself. And yet, no one dared intervene, for the elders insisted that children like Eleanor carried glimpses of truths the living were not meant to know. There were other signs, subtle yet unnerving. Windows rattled in empty houses when Eleanor passed. Animals avoided the Gray household, and the family's own dog would whimper in corners, staring at nothing. Look closely at the old photographs of the village, taken before her death. Among the rows of houses and fences, a small figure often appears at the edge of the frame, standing silently, always observing. It was Eleanor, or perhaps something else that had assumed her form. Some historians later speculated that the child acted as a bridge between the living and the dead, a vessel for memories lost in time, carrying the echoes of vanished children across generations. Even the village church bore its share of secrets. Parish records hinted at unusual rituals and unrecorded burials. Priests spoke quietly of families whose children seemed cursed, their deaths always followed by anomalies. Shadows in post-mortem photographs, graves disturbed, and faint crying that drifted on the night wind. These were not idle superstitions, they were documented accounts of unsettling history that the village had tried to bury alongside its dead. Eleanor's presence amplified these whispers. In the weeks following her burial, neighbors reported hearing faint tapping on windows, as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate. Bells tolled without cause. Footsteps echoed along empty paths. Some claimed to see her walking among the gravestones at dawn, pale and silent, as if the earth itself had released her spirit, carrying with it the unresolved stories of those buried long before her. The Gray family, already haunted by grief, began to uncover unsettling clues. Letters surfaced that had been hidden in the attic, describing vanished children, strange families, and disturbing images that predated their own lives. The documents referenced forbidden languages, rituals performed under the moon, and the idea that certain graves carried energies that refused to rest. Eleanor's first burial had awakened these dormant forces. Her photograph, taken just before interment, captured more than memory. It captured a glimpse of the village's sinister past, a hidden truth etched into shadows that no one dared acknowledge. By now, the village itself had changed. A tension lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. Locals avoided the cemetery, children whispered about ghosts and vanished families, and adults grew uneasy when they passed the Gray household. Something about the past refused to remain silent. The whispers of forgotten events threaded through the town like a chill wind, teasing secrets just beyond comprehension. And in the center of it all was Eleanor. Though she lay beneath the soil, the village felt her presence as if the earth itself could not contain her. Graves shifted subtly, shadows lingered, and the cries of long-forgotten children seemed to echo through the fog. The past was restless, and it would not remain buried. The first burial was only the beginning. Whispers of the past were growing louder, converging on one inescapable truth. Eleanor's story was intertwined with centuries of dark history, disturbing images, and unsettling secrets. And whatever had been stirred in the shadows that day would not allow the child to rest quietly. After Eleanor Gray's burial, the village seemed to hold its breath. Days passed with an unusual stillness, broken only by whispers carried on the wind. The kind of whispers that spoke of vanished children, forgotten events, and unsettling history best left alone. Shadows began to linger longer than they should, and faint shapes appeared at the edges of vision, vanishing whenever anyone looked directly. At first, the villagers tried to dismiss these occurrences as imagination or grief, but the signs became impossible to ignore. The first omen appeared as a faint cry at night. A soft, high-pitched wail drifted through the Gray household, echoing along the empty streets. Doors rattled without wind. Windows shivered, even when tightly closed. Look closely at the post-mortem photograph of Eleanor, taken just days before the funeral, and notice the faint shadow behind her small frame. At first glance, it seems insignificant, perhaps a flaw in the printing. But hidden in that darkness is a shape that could not have existed in the room. A silent warning that the boundary between the living and the dead had been breached. Animals reacted as well. The family dog would growl at empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms. Cats hissed at shadows that no human could see. Even horses balked near the Gray property, ears pricked, eyes wide, as if they sensed a presence unseen. Villagers began to whisper about the child that walks between worlds, a phrase that grew more frequent in hushed conversations. Some recalled stories from older relatives, tales of strange families whose children vanished, only to reappear with knowledge they could not have known. Could Eleanor be one of them? Strange events were not confined to the Gray household. The cemetery itself seemed restless. Freshly turned soil appeared near the graves of other children, soil that no one had disturbed. Bells tolled in the distance, though no wind blew, and the echo carried a note of warning. Shadows moved independently of their owners, shifting with impossible angles. Villagers began to sense a presence lingering over the entire town. one that thrived on fear, one that had been awakened by Eleanor's untimely death. Letters and diaries from the period hint at a growing unease. Neighbors wrote of dreams in which Eleanor appeared, pale and silent, pointing toward graves long forgotten. Some dreams were more vivid, filled with disturbing images. Children buried in haste, families whispering forbidden languages, and photographs that revealed hidden truths when studied in dim candlelight. At first glance, they seemed to depict ordinary events, but closer inspection revealed eerie details: a shadow behind a gravestone, eyes peering from the darkness, faint figures blurred and unaccounted for. It was as if the past itself was trying to communicate. Villagers began to notice small, inexplicable omens. Candles would burn blue instead of yellow, a sign in folklore of spirits lingering. Mirrors reflected shapes that were not in the room. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. And some reported hearing Eleanor's voice, calling softly from the cemetery, sometimes in a language no one recognized, a forbidden language older than memory itself. Each omen carried a warning, a suggestion that the boundary between life and death had been stretched too far, that the child's spirit had not been contained by the earth. The graves themselves were not immune. Furniture shifted inexplicably. Objects disappeared, only to reappear days later in impossible places. Their letters recorded instances of cold spots, unexplained knocking, and fleeting glimpses of a pale figure at the edge of vision. Eleanor's first burial had stirred something dormant, an ancient restlessness that had lingered in the soil, waiting for a child like her to awaken it. Even the village's clergy grew uneasy. Priests spoke in hushed tones of the restless dead, warning families to keep children indoors at night. Some claimed that cemeteries were not merely resting places, but gateways. Look closely at the old photographs preserved in church records. Figures appear at the edges, faint and blurry, shapes that could not be explained by natural light or exposure. These were the signs and omens of a sinister past, disturbances tied to children buried too quickly, too carelessly, or with secrets unspoken. By now, Eleanor's story was no longer confined to grief. The village itself seemed to carry the weight of something unnatural, a presence that refused to be ignored. Shadows moved where they should not, whispers drifted through empty rooms, and dreams carried messages of vanished children, hidden truths, and disturbing images. Every detail, from the faint outline of a figure in a photograph to the sudden collapse of a flower on her grave, hinted at a larger, more sinister reality. The omens grew stronger. The villagers could no longer dismiss them. And in the shadows, the child who had already died once lingered still, a restless presence moving unseen through the streets, the cemetery, and the minds of those who had witnessed her life and death. Something was coming. Something would not rest until the hidden truth of Eleanor Gray and the disturbing secret of her burial was fully revealed. The first burial had not brought peace. The village, already tense with whispers of vanished children and disturbing images, felt the lingering presence of Eleanor Gray in every shadow. Graves shifted subtly, soil sank unnaturally, and the cries of the restless dead seemed to mingle with the wind. Something had been disturbed, something far older and darker than anyone could comprehend. And the villagers would soon discover that one burial was not enough. It began with a discovery at the cemetery. A local caretaker, an elderly man who had tended the grounds for decades, noticed the soil over Eleanor's grave had settled strangely, as if the coffin beneath had shifted or been removed. At first, he assumed it was a natural occurrence, frost heaving the earth or roots pushing upward. But when he looked closer, he found marks in the soil that suggested deliberate disturbance. Small, uneven depressions, footprints too small for an adult, and faint traces of flowers laying with ritual precision. Something, or someone, had returned to the grave. Letters from the Gray family, later recovered, hint at the confusion and terror that followed. They wrote of waking to the sound of digging, of seeing shadows move across their walls, and of hearing Eleanor's voice calling softly in a forbidden language. Look closely at the photographs taken during this period. At first, they appear to depict ordinary mourning, but hidden in the edges are figures no one can identify, shapes that seem to hover over the soil, watching. The family became convinced that the first burial had not contained her, that the child's spirit, or something inhabiting it, was restless. The villagers grew uneasy. Priests were consulted, rituals repeated, prayers whispered into the frost-bitten air. Nothing worked. Every attempt to calm the restless presence seemed only to draw more attention. Candles burned blue. Mirrors reflected shapes that moved independently. And some claimed that Eleanor herself appeared in the house, small and silent, staring with those unnerving eyes that had followed shadows in life. The first burial had awakened something older, something tied to the cemetery's sinister past. Then came the revelation. Eleanor had been buried twice. The second burial, hastily arranged by her parents and the local priest, took place in the oldest section of the cemetery, where the soil had been known to hold restless spirits. It was a desperate attempt to anchor her, to push her presence back into the earth. The ritual was unlike any standard burial. Stones placed in a particular pattern, incantations whispered in a forbidden language, and protective symbols carved into the wooden cross above the grave. At first glance, it seemed a final act of mourning. But the eerie details, the shadows, the shifting soil, the faint echoes of laughter, hinted that this burial, too, might not be enough. Look closely at the post-mortem photographs taken before the second burial. Eleanor's small form lies in repose, but behind her, faint figures appear, blurred and indistinct. Some historians speculate these were manifestations of other children buried in haste or with secrets unspoken. Others claim the photographs captured glimpses of spirits drawn to Eleanor, restless entities drawn by the unnatural events surrounding her death. In either case, the images are unsettling, proof that even in death, Eleanor's story could not remain hidden. The village itself reacted with fear. Children were kept indoors, and adults avoided the cemetery after dusk. Rumors spread of shadows moving across the gravestones, of faint crying carried on the wind, and of small figures glimpsed at the edge of vision. Some claimed to see Eleanor walking among the graves, pale and silent, her eyes fixed on something unseen. The second burial had been performed to contain her, but perhaps containment was never possible. Even the Gray family could not escape the consequences. They recorded dreams in which Eleanor appeared, always pointing toward graves older than her own, places where children had been buried in secrecy. Some dreams included disturbing images of post-mortem photographs, twisted shadows, and faint figures that whispered secrets in languages no living person could understand. The second burial was meant to anchor her, yet every omen, every shadow, suggested that the child, and the hidden truths she carried, remained untethered. By now, the story of Eleanor Gray had become more than a tale of one child. It was entwined with centuries of forgotten events, unsettling history, and the sinister past of the village itself. The double burial, so rare, so unnatural, raised more questions than it answered. Why had her first burial failed? What unseen forces had been disturbed? And what did the photographs, letters, and whispered accounts reveal about the children who had vanished before her, and the families who had tried to bury their secrets along with them? The second burial marked a turning point, yet it was not an ending. The soil had been disturbed, protective symbols carved, prayers spoken, but the shadows remained. Something lingered, watching, waiting, carrying the weight of centuries of dark history and chilling secrets. Eleanor Gray, the child buried twice, had become more than a memory. She had become a harbinger, a link between life and death, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to remain hidden, no matter how carefully the living try to bury them. Amid the unsettling events following Eleanor Gray's double burial, one object captured the village's collective unease: the photograph. An ordinary-looking image at first glance, it depicted the small, pale child in repose, surrounded by her family and the freshly dug grave. But look closely. The photograph was not as simple as it seemed. Hidden in the shadows were details that refused to be explained, unsettling traces of a past the living could not comprehend. The photograph was taken just days before the second burial, when the Grays sought to memorialize Eleanor. She lay small and still, hands folded across her chest, eyes closed in a pale imitation of sleep. Post-mortem photography was not unusual for the era, but this image carried a weight beyond grief. In the background, faint shapes emerged, shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally, figures no one recognized, almost imperceptible yet unmistakably present. At first, villagers claimed it was a trick of light, a flaw in the photographic process. But those who studied it closely, the letter's note, began to feel a chill that would not dissipate. Some saw the shadows as other children, pale and ghost-like, remnants of lives lost in secrecy, buried in haste or forgotten by history. Others suggested something darker, that these figures were not ghosts at all, but extensions of Eleanor herself, echoing her restless presence even before the second burial. The image hinted at something no one could verbalize, a hidden truth that connected the child to the cemetery's oldest secrets, to vanished children, and to disturbing events the village had long tried to ignore. The villagers' reactions were immediate. Parents pulled their children away from the gray home. Local clergy, called to examine the image, whispered about forbidden language and rituals performed incorrectly, about restless spirits that photographs sometimes revealed. Even the caretaker of the cemetery refused to step near Eleanor's grave after viewing the photograph, claiming that the image had looked back at him, a phrase repeated in letters, diaries, and oral accounts alike. Look closely at the photograph once more. At the far edge, near the iron gate of the cemetery, a small figure stands, barely visible, but undeniably present. At first glance, it might seem a trick of shadow or fading print, but hidden in the shape is something sinister. A face that bears no resemblance to any living person in the village, eyes staring directly at the viewer, as if watching beyond the photograph itself. Villagers whispered that the figure was one of the vanished children, a witness to Eleanor's restless spirit, silently marking the moment the second burial failed to contain her fully. Letters from the Gray household provide further context. Eleanor, even in life, had been drawn to old photographs, examining them with an intensity that unsettled adults. She pointed to shapes no one else saw, whispered words in forbidden language, and sometimes seemed to converse with the shadows captured on film. In death, this tendency did not vanish. The photograph was not merely a record of her body, but a window into the unsettling history she carried. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the folds of her dress, the shadows behind her, told a story that had been forgotten, lost in time until the image was uncovered. Historians studying post-mortem photography have noted the peculiarities of this era. Images often recorded more than memory, capturing subtle anomalies that could hint at lingering spirits or unfinished business. Eleanor's photograph is a prime example. Disturbing images hidden in the corners, faint impressions of figures that cannot be explained, subtle irregularities that defy the conventions of 19th century photography. At first glance, they are easy to miss. But the longer one studies the image, the more apparent it becomes that the child, the cemetery, and the village itself are entwined in a network of haunting, chilling secrets. The photograph became a focus for both fear and obsession. Villagers who gazed too long reported sleepless nights, whispers in the air, and the sensation of being watched. Children refused to pass the Gray home, citing the shadow that follows you in the image. And the Gray family, already strained by grief and fear, became convinced that Eleanor's spirit lingered, tethered not only to the graves, but to the photograph itself. It was as if the image had become a conduit, a visual echo of a child whose story had been interrupted, whose burial had failed to anchor her fully to the earth. Even decades later, the photograph remains a central artifact of the story. Scholars of dark history, forbidden language, and haunted places study it closely, attempting to decipher its chilling secrets. Look closely again. At the faintest corner, a hand reaches from the shadows, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. Disturbing images like this suggest that Eleanor Gray's story was never meant to end quietly, that even in death, she, and perhaps the other vanished children captured unknowingly by the camera, refused to remain hidden, lost in time. The photograph, with its shadows and ghostly figures, its eerie details and unsettling implications, became the key to understanding the mystery. And yet, it revealed only more questions. Why did these shapes appear? Were they spirits, echoes, or warnings? And what did they signify about Eleanor's second burial, the restless cemetery, and the sinister past of the village itself? Long after Eleanor Gray's second burial, the village remained shrouded in unease. Shadows lingered over streets and gravestones alike. Whispers of vanished children, disturbing images, and haunted places persisted, carried by the wind and the memories of those who had lived through the tragedy. And it was here, amid the fog and silence, that investigators, historians, paranormal researchers, and curious villagers began to piece together the hidden truth. The first step was the Gray household itself. Letters, diaries, and faded photographs were examined in detail. Each document hinted at forgotten events, strange families, and unsettling history. Eleanor had not been merely a child. She had been a witness, a link between the living and the dead, a carrier of secrets long buried in time. Look closely at the post-mortem photographs, and the details grow more alarming. Shadows that bend unnaturally, blurred figures that seem to move when no one is present, and faint inscriptions on gravestones that suggest a knowledge forbidden to the living. Investigators turned to the village cemetery. Careful examination revealed anomalies in both burials. Soil had been disturbed more than once. Footprints appeared where none should exist. Some graves bore marks of ritualistic symbols, partially erased by time but visible to the trained eye. These were not random acts. They suggested intent, as though someone, or something, had deliberately interfered with the resting places of children, including Eleanor. The evidence pointed to a pattern, one that connected families across generations and hinted at a sinister past buried beneath the village. Old parish records offered more clues. Entries were inconsistent, names erased, and some children who should have been recorded were conspicuously absent. One particularly chilling account described a family who spoke in a forbidden language, whose children had vanished, only to reappear days later, pale and silent, carrying knowledge no one could explain. Eleanor's family fit this pattern, linking her story to a series of unsolved mysteries that stretched back decades. Forgotten events, once dismissed as coincidence, now formed a tapestry of eerie repetition. Even the photographs were examined under new scrutiny. Forensic historians noted the unnatural composition of shadows and shapes, suggesting more than simple optical effects. Disturbing images appeared at the edges. Small figures blurred into gravestones, hands reaching from the soil, eyes staring from the darkness. Look closely, and it seems as though the cemetery itself is alive, responding to the presence of the child who had been buried twice. Some theorized that Eleanor's spirit had merged with these residual energies, leaving traces in both photographs and memory. Letters from the Grays painted a picture of escalating dread. They described objects moving, cold spots, unexplained knocking, and dreams where Eleanor appeared in places she had never been. These accounts, once dismissed as grief-stricken imagination, gained credibility when compared with reports from neighbors. Lights flickering over the cemetery at night, faint laughter carried on the wind, and shadows moving independently of any human source. All signs pointed to a restless presence, tied to both Eleanor and the village's sinister past. Researchers also uncovered references to lost-in-time children, those who had vanished, left no records, yet whose echoes seemed to haunt the village. These children, many of them captured in faded old photos or whispered accounts, shared traits with Eleanor: a strange awareness, a connection to disturbing events, and the uncanny ability to appear where they were not expected. The investigation revealed patterns suggesting that Eleanor's story was not isolated. She had become part of a larger web, entwined with chilling secrets that spanned generations, families, and graves. One particularly disturbing discovery was the mention of post-mortem photography used to capture children who had died under unusual circumstances. Scholars noted that these photographs often carried eerie anomalies, faint traces of figures or shapes that could not be explained. Eleanor's images fit this pattern exactly. At first glance, they were mourning photographs, but hidden in the shadows were clues, disturbing details that hinted at a truth too unsettling for the villagers to confront. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Eleanor's double burial was only part of the story. The village itself, its cemetery, and the photographs were tied to an enduring presence, one that defied reason. Hidden truths surfaced: families whose histories were erased, children who vanished and returned changed, and disturbing images that revealed more than memory. The mystery was far from solved, and the more evidence accumulated, the more chilling it became. The investigators realized that some questions might never be answered. Who had disturbed Eleanor's first grave? Why had the second burial failed to contain her fully? And what did the shadows in the photographs truly represent? Every discovery deepened the horror, revealing a sinister past that had been deliberately concealed. A network of lost children, strange families, and haunted places bound together by fear, secrecy, and the unsettling persistence of dark history. As night fell over the village, the investigators retreated, leaving behind the graves, the letters, and the photographs. But the sense of being watched did not fade. The shadows lingered. The whispers continued. And Eleanor Gray, the child buried twice, remained at the center of a mystery that refused to be forgotten, a mystery whose hidden truths might never be fully uncovered. Long after Eleanor Gray's second burial, the village remained under the weight of a lingering dread. Her story had imprinted itself upon the land, the homes, and the minds of those who had witnessed the strange events. Shadows stretched longer, even on sunny days, and whispers carried through the streets like echoes of the past. The fear was no longer just about a child. It had become the legacy of an unsettling history, a reminder that some truths could never be buried. Families spoke quietly of vanished children, of disturbing images that refused to fade from memory, and of strange figures glimpsed at the edges of photographs. The Gray family, once insular, became symbols of both grief and fear. Parents warned their children not to wander near the cemetery, and local clergy urged caution, whispering of restless spirits and the consequences of disturbing old graves. Eleanor's double burial had left a mark, a visible and invisible scar that altered the rhythm of village life forever. Even decades later, stories persisted. Children reported faint laughter drifting from the woods at night, and some claimed to see pale figures standing among gravestones. Scholars examining old photographs noted unsettling details: shadows that did not belong, faint shapes of children who had long vanished, and figures that seemed to move when observed indirectly. Look closely, and these images suggest that Eleanor's presence, and the stories of other lost children, had left a permanent imprint on the visual record of the village. The village itself seemed to remember. Doors would creak open on their own. Windows rattled when no wind blew. Animals avoided certain paths, and the cemetery retained a restless energy that unsettled anyone who approached. The people who had once dismissed superstition began to accept the dark reality. Some forces were beyond explanation, and some children, like Eleanor, were never truly at rest. Letters from the Gray household, preserved for posterity, described a growing sense of inevitability. Objects moved without explanation. Shadows lingered in corners. Dreams became increasingly vivid, carrying warnings from the past and glimpses of vanished children. Eleanor had become more than a memory. She was a presence that refused to be ignored, a haunting figure in the collective consciousness of the village. Even historians and paranormal researchers who studied the story centuries later acknowledged the enduring impact. Eleanor's tale was no mere anecdote of loss. It was a case study in the intersection of dark history, disturbing images, and restless spirits. The patterns of vanished children, strange families, and unsettling events that had haunted the village before her birth now converged around her story, forming a chilling network that linked past and present. The legacy of fear extended beyond the village. Letters, diaries, and photographs circulated among scholars, hinting at truths that could not be fully explained. Post-mortem photography, forbidden languages, and whispered accounts of shadows and figures all pointed to a world where death was not a conclusion but a threshold. Eleanor's presence acted as a bridge, connecting generations of unsettled spirits and the living who dared to uncover them. Look closely at the photograph of Eleanor's second burial. At first, it appears serene, a child laid to rest, a family in mourning. But the shadows in the corners reveal more. Faint figures standing behind the mourners, shapes crouched near the edge of the frame, and eyes that seemed to follow the viewer. These details were not accidental. They were evidence of the village's dark history, of a child who had been buried twice yet refused to be forgotten, and of a legacy that would continue to unsettle anyone who dared to observe too closely. Stories told in hushed voices warned that the curse of remembrance was inescapable. Forgotten events, lost in time, resurfaced with each generation. Vanished children, disturbing images, and hidden truths reappeared, haunting those who attempted to piece together the past. Eleanor's tale, entwined with these histories, served as a reminder. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some graves are not meant to remain undisturbed, and some children, even in death, refuse to rest. The village, now forever shaped by fear, moved cautiously through life. Residents avoided the cemetery at night. Visitors noticed the oppressive stillness in the air, and the stories persisted, growing richer and darker with each retelling. Eleanor Gray, the forgotten child buried twice, had ensured that her presence and the chilling secrets of the village would remain a part of local memory indefinitely. Her story was more than a tale of tragedy. It was a warning, a record of disturbing images, vanished children, strange families, and the restless energy of haunted places. And as long as anyone remembered, as long as the photographs were studied and the whispers recounted, the legacy of fear would endure. The story of Eleanor Gray ends not with resolution, but with lingering questions. A child buried twice, a photograph that captures more than memory, a village haunted by shadows and whispers. Her tale is a testament to the unsettling persistence of hidden truths. Even now, long after the graves have settled, the legacy of fear endures. The soil may appear calm, but beneath it, the echoes of the past pulse quietly, reminding us that some stories refuse to die. The double burial of Eleanor Gray revealed more than the grief of a family. It revealed the fragile boundary between life and death, between memory and oblivion. Postmortem photography captured her form, but also the restless presence of those long gone, of vanished children whose names had faded from history, of strange families who had endured secrets too terrible to speak. Every detail, the shadows and photographs, the disturbed soil, the whispered voices, spoke of a hidden truth that the living could neither fully grasp nor escape. Her story is intertwined with the dark history of the village, a history of lost children, forbidden languages, and disturbing images that refuse to be forgotten. Each shadow, each faint figure in old photographs, suggests that Eleanor's presence was never entirely confined by her burials. The cemetery itself, the haunted ground, remains a testament to centuries of tragedy and secrecy. Look closely at the records, at the letters preserved in fading ink, and the unsettling details emerge. Names erased, graves disturbed, patterns of vanishing children, all signs of a sinister past that continues to linger in the present. The photograph, perhaps more than any other artifact, serves as the bridge between the known and the unknown. At first glance, it seems a simple memorial. But hidden within its edges are chilling secrets. The faint outline of figures who do not belong, shadows that bend unnaturally, and the unmistakable impression of eyes that follow the observer. Historians, paranormal researchers, and those who dared to study it closely have all remarked upon the same sensation, a quiet, persistent unease, the feeling of being watched by someone, or something, that should no longer exist. The Greys themselves could not escape this legacy. Letters describe shifting objects, sudden chills, and glimpses of a pale child in corners of the home. Dreams carry warnings, whispered in a forbidden language no living person could understand. Even those long after the events have felt Eleanor's presence, as if her story had embedded itself into the very fabric of the village. This is the burden of forgotten events, of chilling secrets, of unsettling history that refuses to remain hidden. The lessons of Eleanor Gray's tale are grim. Sometimes, grief is not enough to contain the forces we cannot understand. Sometimes, a child's life, her death, and even her burial cannot erase the imprint left on the world. Strange families, vanished children, haunted places, They remind us that history is not always orderly, that dark truths are often buried beneath layers of denial and forgetfulness, waiting for someone to notice the subtle, eerie details. Even today, travelers who visit the village report a suffocating stillness, a sense that someone is observing them. Shadows appear where there should be none. At dusk, faint cries echo from the woods, as if the restless energy of Eleanor and the other lost children persists, carrying stories that the living cannot yet comprehend. These are not tales to entertain, they are warnings, glimpses into a sinister past, reminders that some histories are unsolved mysteries, and some children are never truly gone. The second burial, intended to anchor Eleanor Gray, failed in ways the villagers could not have imagined. Soil may cover a body, but it cannot bury the essence of a story, the resonance of a presence, or the memory of disturbing images. Look closely at the photographs, at the faded letters, and at the whispers that drift through time. They all testify to the same reality. The forgotten child buried twice continues to speak, silently, through shadows, through soil, and through the unsettling truths that remain hidden in the corners of history. Eleanor Gray's story is a reminder of the fragile boundary between what we accept as reality and what lingers just beyond perception. Vanished children, eerie families, forbidden languages, and haunted places all converge in her tale, creating a chilling tapestry of loss, mystery, and unresolved history. The child's double burial was not merely an act of mourning, it was an awakening of something older, a signal that some truths cannot be confined by death alone. And so the village remains, a place where the past is never fully at rest, where the whispers of the forgotten speak in forbidden languages, and where the photograph of a small, pale child reminds us that the hidden truths of history are never truly gone. The soil may settle, graves may be marked, but the essence of Eleanor Gray and the legacy of fear she left behind endures. Somewhere, in the shadows of the cemetery, in the edges of old photographs, and in the quiet moments when the wind carries a whisper, the forgotten child reminds us. Not all mysteries can be solved, not all stories can be forgotten, and some children are never truly at rest. The story of Eleanor Gray ends here. But her presence does not. Somewhere beneath the soil, among the shadows, and behind the faded photographs, the echoes of a child who was buried twice still linger. History may forget, the living may move on, but some truths refuse to remain hidden. The whispers of vanished children, the secrets of strange families, and the chilling details of haunted places endure, waiting for the curious, the brave, or the foolish to notice. Look closely at the shadows around you. Listen carefully when the wind carries a soft cry. And remember, not all children who vanish, not all graves that are dug, and not all mysteries that are hidden. Stay gone. Eleanor Gray's story is a warning, a haunting reminder that some truths are buried, but never forgotten. The shadows are watching. Are you?